Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking to the writer and editor Sarah Rich. Sarah frequently writes about design and food, and her work has been published in places like Dwell, Wired, The Atlantic, and Fast Company. She also recently helped edit Leave Me Alone with the Recipes, which is this really fascinating new book about the often overlooked designer Cipe Pineles. The book is sort of part monograph, part cookbook, part tribute, and just a great introduction to a designer who, in my opinion, deserves much more notoriety than she is often given. But my first introduction to Sarah's work was actually a few years ago when she edited a Medium publication about design called Reform. The publication billed itself as a field guide to the designed world, and though it only existed for, 10 months or so, they published some truly excellent pieces of design writing on topics from Disneyland to farming to speculative design to autonomous cars. Some of the essays they published there had a profound impact on my own thinking about design writing or design criticism or kind of, whatever you want to call that discourse. And it really was the kind of design writing that I aspire to. In this episode, Sarah and I talk about Reform, how it started, what her editorial plans were, how they commissioned stories, as well as how and why it ended. We also talk about her new book and the influence of Cipe Pineles. We talk about the challenges in financially supporting design writing, as well as how her own definition of design has evolved over the years. This was a really fun conversation for me. I'm a huge fan of Sarah's work, and especially, as you'll hear when we talk, still miss Reform a lot. All the archives are still up, and I have links to the pieces that we talk about in the show notes, so I encourage you to go take a look and see the kind of writing that they published there, and enjoy this conversation with Sarah Rich. I kind of came to your work 3 or 4 years ago, but I don't know too much about your early background. And so I kind of wanted to start with, kind of going as far back as we can with where your interest in writing came from, or how you decided you wanted to be a writer.
Well, I think I always wanted to be a writer from, childhood. And I don't exactly know where that came from. I didn't have professional writers in my family, but I was just interested in writing stories and always did it as a kid. And I think had some kind of notion that I wanted that to be what I did eventually, but I don't think I knew how I was going to get there. So in college, I majored in cultural and social anthropology, which was in part just a way because it was a major that allowed you to take a lot of courses outside the department. So I actually did a lot of religious studies, and I minored in creative writing and poetry. But I did a lot of different stuff. But I do feel like in a way, the professional life I've built is a cultural anthropological kind of profession. I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about culture and people and behavior and, the lives we lead. So, but I would say the way I really kind of made a intentional go at it was when I was probably 24, a couple years out of college, and I took an internship at Dwell magazine. Okay. And that was how I actually also discovered design. I mean, I didn't have an interest in design. I don't think I really had an idea of what design was. And when I went to Dwell, I was able to, just spend whole days sitting in their little offices on the internet, on the early internet, because it was early internet days. And so the design space on the internet was awesome because there weren't that many people, and it was just such a different world. I just have such nostalgic feelings for those days because I feel like for me it was a real time of discovery and just there are people that I met at that time who were starting to blog about design online, who are still my colleagues and friends, and it's changed so much. But I sort of started to figure out like what design meant, and it meant a lot of different things, especially because working at Dwell, it was kind of one thing, and then as I moved on from there, it became a lot of other things. So right after I left Dwell, I mean, if you really want to hear the details, kind of the funny story of early like serendipity is that I took a job. There was a posting on a site that probably still exists called Creative Hot List.
Oh, yeah. I remember that.
So there was a post on Creative Hot List. It didn't say who had posted it, but it said something like "need writer." It said "need writer." We're illiterate. Need writer. Corporate hacks need not apply, or something like that. And it was such a short post, and I had no idea what it was, and I sent my thing in to them, and what it turned out to be was the major global architecture firm Snøhetta, and they were they were launching a tiny little prefab house company, and they were looking for a brand writer, and I don't know still to this day exactly why they decided to hire me. They were all in Oslo and I was in San Francisco, but they hired me, and I was terrified because I felt totally underqualified. And so I bought like 1 million books about branding and read them all, and then ended up doing all the brand language for this little company, which launched and existed for a while and then went away. But Snøhetta obviously still exists.
Yeah.
And I just self-taught. Like I learned so much about branding during that time, and they entrusted me with a lot of responsibility to giving a voice to this brand. Anyway, so from there, I went to Inhabitat and World Changing, which were both at that time, like, kind of among the set of design and environmental sustainability blogs that were really active. And then came back to Dwell as a senior editor later, and then went freelance, and I've been freelance ever since.
Oh, okay. So you were at Dwell. You had two kind of
times I had two rounds.
Okay.
Yeah, I was a senior editor there for like 3 years.
Okay, I didn't realize. So I have a couple questions, kind of just based on that a little bit. I actually think the Snøhetta thing is interesting with and especially that it was this prefab kind of subdivision or new, completely new company, which I actually didn't know that. I didn't know they did that, but I recently interviewed Carrie Jacobs, and we talked a lot about her time at Dwell also when I talked to her, and about how so early at Dwell prefab was kind of core to that magazine. And so, there is that kind of interesting connection between the two, even though you didn't know anything about branding.
Yes.
You probably had all of that background in the prefab world already.
Yeah, I did. And my most cynical, many years later self also thinks, I had Dwell on my little tiny resume, which consisted of very little. But I think that was like one of their big targets in terms of like, if they were going to launch this company, they really wanted Dwell to pay attention. So if I had been at Dwell and I was in San Francisco, that was probably a good bet for them in terms of getting some press. Right. And indeed it did work that way. So, maybe they weren't sure about this 24-year-old out in San Francisco, but at least they felt like they could get like a valuable press hit off it. But in the end, I think I delivered on the job as well.
That's amazing. I'm going to step back for a second before I kind of ask the question. Something I noticed when I was looking over your entire body of work is that kind of two major themes that you return to again and again are design, but then also like food and eating and how we eat and how we get food and things like that. And so the cultural anthropology, I think, actually makes those two themes make a lot of sense. And I kind of see that background now a little bit more. But I'm curious, when you got your first job at Dwell, or the first time at Dwell, and you said you kind of never really thought about design or knew what design was, what was it about Dwell? Did you kind of know what you were getting into, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask?
No, I don't think I knew what I was getting into. And I think the kind of design I discovered at Dwell was like a first stepping stone towards discovering the sort of much more all-encompassing cultural function of design that I feel like I sort of orbit around now. At first it was like architecture, it was houses, it was
Right.
furniture, it was objects, it might have been cities, but that's kind of as far as it went at that point, I guess. And then I was also have always been interested in environmentalism and sustainability. And so I think in a way that was the next place I went with it. Jill Fehrenbacher was starting in Habitat like right at the moment that I left that internship. And it was kind of a similar thing where I'd been reading, I think she launched in Habitat. I'd been reading it for like the 2 weeks or 3 weeks since she launched it. And I wrote to her and was like, hey, if you ever want someone to write some stuff. And then the two of us kind of grew that blog together for the first year or so. And then it grew from there.
Okay.
But so that was, I would say, then kind of the next stepping stone where I was like, oh, design is also a tool for solving these problems that are related to the environment and related to, a lot of other things. And then that took me to World Changing, which really kind of busted open the doors on what design could mean. And that was where like Doors of Perception and John Thackeray and all of these like people that I suddenly came into contact with who were doing what, I and many other people sort of say of like using design as a lens through which to really look at like everything.
Yep.
And that was what resonated most for me. And that was why also food became an area where I felt like I could connect design, because I've always loved and been interested in food and cooking. That's another thing that's just like been with me forever. And so I think I started to crave a way to sort of like merge those two things. And that sort of broad way of examining things through design was a way to also look at food and to look at sustainability all at once. So I did a bunch of that kind of at the intersection of those three things.
Yeah. I mean, that's so interesting. I feel like that's become one of the major themes of this podcast, and a thing that comes up again and again when I talk to people is how so many people, and myself included, design started as this kind of narrow thing. It was about kind of creating objects. And then as you work, as you kind of see these different things, it becomes much more about processes and becomes this lens through which you can look at everything else. I also I'm sorry to bring up, all these previous guests, but I talked to Jeff Maynall recently also. And he said something
staying at my house. He left this morning.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We're good friends. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm a huge fan of his work also. And he said something that really resonated with me and became, after I talked to him, it became a kind of phrase that I've repeated again and again, where for him, architecture was the center of this Venn diagram of all his other interests. And it was this way he could talk about all these other things. And I feel like that's what design is for me. And when I talk about design writing, it is, and design criticism, it's not just, let's talk about this chair or this logo or this poster and what it looks like, but as this lens that we can talk about politics, economics, sustainability, all of these other things. I know, I don't want to kind of jump too far around, and I know we're kind of missing some pieces in your background, but I think this actually is a way to talk about reform a little bit, because that was one of the things that I really loved about that publication. Is I feel like that was kind of the guiding ethos of that. And so I was wondering if you could kind of, just kind of describe what that publication was and how you kind of got involved with it, and what your editorial direction was for the site, and how you thought about the types of writing that you wanted to publish there.
Sure. The way I got involved with it was that Medium got a BMW sponsorship to do something, and it was the first time they'd had like a corporate sponsor to do some kind of editorial project. And I guess it was determined among them that the subject would be design. But that was kind of as far as it went, was like BMW's got this chunk of money and they're going to pay us to make basically a magazine within Medium about design. So they brought me in to edit that, and kind of just said, like, how do you want to, it was
nice.
they'd already named it. They'd named it Reform. And they had done some preliminary stuff with another editor. And then they brought me in pretty close to launch. And it was kind of like a crunch to get it launched in time. But they really didn't have many parameters around what we would cover. And I felt like what I wanted to do was kind of like look at the world, look at culture, tell design stories. But that I didn't want to do a product blog. I didn't want to be like a, furniture porn website. Like I didn't want any of that. And I think BMW was pretty open to, well, not only open, I mean, BMW planned not to essentially interfere in any way in any of the content, the caveat being that there was like a set of posts that were going to be about BMW, but they were going to be design stories about BMW, and those would be explicitly like, those were the sponsor posts. And outside of that, like I had pretty much total creative license and nobody sort of dictating what it looked like. So I kind of just pulled, I think I sent an email out to like all of my whole network of writer friends and said like, hey, I get to start a design publication. Pitch me.
Yeah.
And I didn't actually get very many responses initially, but I had a few story ideas. And the launch was kind of a combination of like some ideas that I had that I assigned to people who wanted to take them, and then a few ideas that people brought to me.
Okay.
And as time went on, it continued to be a combination of like me having an idea. Either I wrote some of the content, I assigned a bunch of it, or as time went on and the site kind of took hold in a certain community of readers, I started to get more and more pitches from people. And the not insignificant aspect of it was that we had a bunch of money to pay writers, and that was great because I asked writers that I know get paid very well to write in other places if they would write for me, and I felt confident saying like, I can pay you a competitive fee for this piece. And so part of what went away when it went away was that money.
Right.
And so it was a lot harder to have like a really solid ground to stand on.
Okay. Was there thought that the publication would continue after the sponsorship?
Yeah, I mean, they wanted to have they either wanted BMW to renew or they wanted to find another sponsor. But at the time, they didn't really have much of a sales engine inside media at all. So they just essentially, what I learned, which was very interesting to know, is that many corporations only want to sponsor the launch of something. They don't want to sponsor the sustenance of something because launch gets you all this earned press, all this just like extra bonus media that's just because it's new.
Right.
And so they really only want to be associated with something that's new. And if it's not new anymore, even if it's doing great and getting tons of readers, which we were breaking through all of the goals that they had set for readership, it didn't matter because they just didn't really want, they didn't care. So, and no new sponsors came on. There were like a few, maybe this person, maybe that person's going to come, and then nobody did.
Interesting. I mean, I remember when the site launched, and I remember reading, I actually just went back and reread your kind of introductory post that you had titled A Field Guide to the Designed World, which I actually didn't remember that phrase, but actually ends up feeling like a really good description of what the site became. And I remember, I think it was Ian Bogos on Disney and the Magic Band.
Yes.
And I read your piece and his piece and was just completely blown away. And this was kind of mid 2004, early 2004, I think.
2014.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's what I meant. 2014. And this was right as I was starting to think very seriously about design writing and criticism, and was thinking about going back to school. And suddenly there was this publication that was talking about design in a way that I wanted to see more of. I'm not just, just trying to compliment you. I read all of them. I loved it, and I was really sad to see it go. I'm kind of curious. I have two questions that may or may not be related. The first one is how you thought about the audience, or who you thought the audience was, or who you were writing for, and then how you kind of selected. This is a big question, and I'm sorry, this is probably impossible to answer, how you knew when a story was right for Reform and when it wasn't, because it was very particular, but the topics were very expansive. It was everything from Disney to driving cars to, or self-driving cars to farming. How'd you kind of parse that out?
Well, to answer the first question, I mean, who I thought the audience was going to be, I was a little unsure because on Medium, especially when we were starting this, now like 3.5 years ago, the kind of one of the first things I did, in part because the editor who brought me in wanted to be sure that we capitalized on what was already out in like the whole vast Medium landscape, which would be, if somebody out in the Medium community is writing about design, we want to pull that voice into our domain. So I was trying to search for design stories on Medium at first when I was coming on, and I remember if you just literally search Medium for design, and it didn't have an intuitive search process, but if you did that, what you came up with was UX design for the most part. The majority of people were talking about design in that context, or UI, and not how I think about design. And so I was like, I wonder how we're going to find, if anyone out there is actually writing about design the way I was thinking about it, how are we going to find them? And then also, if anyone who's reading Medium right now comes across what I'm doing, are they really going to care? Right. And then outside of who already exists and pays attention to Medium, how are we going to bring in new readers? And I think part of that was a function of, social media, because, I have modest but not tiny following, and then I'm connected to people who have insane followings. And so there was an extent to which, if we posted a good story, we could generate attention for it well outside of the Medium sphere. And then people started to pay attention, and maybe they read the next one that came out. The Ian Bogost post that went up, it was one of the launch posts, was super instrumental, I think, in the launch, because it was just such a kick-ass story, and Ian's an incredibly good writer, and it hit on design exactly how I intended to think about it, in a totally cultural, contextual, narrative way, while still being also about this device, and it marks so many things about where we are as a culture, and it just did so many things I loved. I still love it.
I reread it recently, and it's such a good piece.
Yeah, it's awesome. So that was great. And I guess that sort of leads to answering the second part of the question in a way, because part of it is, I think I just, in the course of my career, 10 plus years, well, more than that now, I feel like I have a network, a community of people who are kind of thinking in the same little spaces as I am. And so part of it was I could think of people, Ian among them, who I wanted to just be I want you to write for me. And I think if I tell you that it's about design, you're going to interpret that the way you're going to interpret it. And I trust that interpretation is going to be an awesome addition to this content.
Right.
And that worked out many times, because there were a lot of people who do that. And each of them might do it a little differently, but it made the right kind of variety.
Right.
Because it was so Ian was going to take it and make it about the Disney World wristband, but then, I'm looking at it now. It's been a while, but I'm just scanning. My Christina Agapakis, who's a microbiologist. Where I was Christina, write about design, and it's she did design for the microbiome, which is completely not about it's another whole world entirely. But so it spanned a lot of subjects by virtue of that. I had a couple people who wanted to write for me super regularly, Paul Lucas, who did a regular thing for me. And he sometimes came, he was an example of, sometimes he would have an idea because he did a bunch of them for me. And I would be I don't know. And he would be no, and he would give me some really compelling argument. And most of the time I was okay. And then a couple of times those turned out to be really, really popular, even when I was dubious.
Right.
So how did I don't know. I mean, there is to some degree a sort of instinct, I think, around it. There's something about having a story be unexpected, and yet be about something super ordinary. I love that type of story.
Yeah.
Another one of my favorite ones that I'm just noticing was Sarah Laskow wrote about a place where antler farms.
Oh,
Deer
yeah.
are bred to have giant antlers, and then hunters can like pay to access this particular space where they can shoot deer who have been bred to have huge antlers, so
I
that they come
forgot
home
all
with like
about
a
that one.
trophy, which is ridiculous. It's
Yeah.
like an insane story, and in some ways very sad, because the sort of like animal treatment in that is really
Yeah.
troubling. But that being said, like, it was a really, from a design perspective, like, it is really fascinating. Okay, these animals are being bred to grow these things that people want to take home and put on their walls, which sort of like define their like virility or masculinity, or I don't know what. It just has so many. It has so many ripples of significance, and yet the thing itself is quite mundane in a way.
Right.
So I love that kind of story. I'm always looking for that.
The reason I kind of ask that, and I think you started to answer it a little bit, but something that I think about a lot, and something that comes up in a lot of these conversations that I have, is the challenges of writing about design for a general audience without kind of dumbing it down or oversimplifying it, so that the people who are in the profession and know this stuff can also enjoy it. And I feel like so many of the stories that you publish there hit that spot where I could see people who kind of know nothing about these subjects, who wouldn't consider themselves interested in design, read these and learn something and be excited about them. And then me and all my designer friends were reading it and also learning it. And so I'm kind of curious how you think about that. And both from an editor and as a writer, of kind of hitting both of those audiences at the same time.
I mean, I think what comes to mind a little way is to extend that whole metaphor of using design as a lens, and to say that I think I operate with the expectation that people's lenses have like different degrees of granularity
like
or something.
that.
Like, I think that there are general readers who are going to read the story and take away one thing from it, and there might be super wonky design people who will read it and take something else away from it, or they'll take some combination of what each other's going to get. But I like to have a story read as an interesting story and narrative from a cultural perspective anyway. And then where the design layers come in might be increasingly obvious to people with increasing amounts of knowledge about design. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, like, I'm looking, Rob Walker wrote a thing about the suburbs. Rob Walker, the genius of design criticism, and it's like total honor for me to have him writing for me. But he did several pieces, and there was this one that could just be read as like a well-written musing about suburbia, but you could also take much deeper stuff. And and that's not to say that the writers aren't doing work to make it a design story. I mean, they all do, and they all make a case for why it's about design and it's not just about whatever. I mean, it's in there. It's not like it's only going to be visible to someone who knows about design, but I think the interest level that someone might have in the design aspects of it will vary. But the story, I like to stand on its own as a cool story anyway.
Right. Yeah. Did you have a imagined audience there? You know what I mean? Like, not like an ideal reader, but who were the types of people that you were hoping would kind of grab onto these stories?
I don't think I had that in my head, but I can say, like, in the early going, what was really gratifying is when people that I really respect and admire expressed admiration for what was happening on Reform. That made me feel like, okay, I'm doing something right because these people think it's good.
Yeah.
And that was nice. And I could name a few people that said that, but I felt like, that's what led me. That's what sort of like gave me a little boost to keep going. And somewhere along the line, like, I feel like the idea that it was a design criticism publication started to be mentioned. And that too felt like, oh, that was a very affirming thing, because I don't think I would have ever phrased it that way myself, in part because
Okay.
I don't feel like I can call myself a design critic based on anything other than
Yeah.
what I've done. But I appreciated that that was how it was being interpreted, so.
Okay, I mean that's interesting because that's my last. I have one more question about reform because I could easily spend our whole time just going through
It's fun to think about it. I loved it.
every story that I loved, but that was something I was curious about is kind of, and I don't mean for you to put labels on it, where you don't want to, but did you consider it criticism or journalism or reporting? Like, how did you think about its purpose?
I think, no, I hesitate to use any of those labels, partly because, I didn't go to school for theory or criticism or even journalism. And I don't want to claim to have a certain like pedigree that I don't have. I think I'm pretty self-taught.
Yeah.
And so, no, I wouldn't call it any of those things. I mean, I tried to be like accurate and fair at the most basic level of like journalistic approach. But I didn't expect this to be treated as, investigative reporting or anything like that. And, and as far as criticism goes, I think that's just a word that I think some people use the word criticism and have a common understanding of what they mean by that. And I feel very much at the edge of that population of people.
Yeah.
I kind of get it, but I don't necessarily feel like I have enough of a grasp on what is and isn't criticism to ever claim that what I'm doing is that thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally get that. I mean, this podcast started, the tagline of it is the intersection of criticism and practice. And even I'm a little weary sometimes of that word criticism or critical discourse or something like that, because it does feel like that carries a lot of meaning, and I think a lot of the type of writing that I'm talking about and the writers I talk to fit under that, but there are also other things that are kind of on the edges but are part of the discourse in important ways. So I think that's interesting.
I mean, just in terms of you asking about like getting a popular audience to read it, I mean, when you start throwing around the phrase critical discourse, like you're not really getting at a popular audience.
Right.
And I feel like I and many people I know do tend to get a little like academic and wonky. And I definitely wanted to avoid that, because if I had any idea of what the audience I wanted to have a good sized audience. So you don't want to start out with something that's going to like alienate a bunch of people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a great point. I know I said I had one more question. That was my last question. I do have one more question about it. Did you find that people, I don't know. Again, I don't know how to phrase. Did you find that the types of pieces you were publishing, there was a space for those? Like people were wanting something like that, and you kind of filled the site filled a void for a specific type of design writing that people wanted?
Yes, I really do feel that way. I don't think I set out to do that, and I don't even know if I quite knew we were doing it as it was happening. But when it went away, I got a lot of feedback that was the case, that it was doing something that other publications weren't doing, and that it was missed for that reason. And that really made me feel kind of, super gratified, because I felt, oh, wow, that was a really meaningful thing to a certain number of people, even if it was a tiny number, and also it made me feel a little sad, because I felt like, wow, well, there was this receptive audience that wanted it to keep going. It's a real shame that it couldn't, just based on circumstances that weren't related to the quality of the content.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of why I asked, because for me, it filled that gap, and I was kind of curious if that was a larger trend, because I also feel like in the time since there haven't really been any replacements. I think there are a lot of sites that are kind of doing, I mean, I don't want to kind of talk badly about other sites, but there are a lot of publications that are kind of doing a light version of it, a very popular version of it, but not with the depth that Reform had. And I feel like that is a gap that someone could fill, and it's just not there yet.
Well, if anyone ever hands me a big chunk of money, I would totally keep it going again. I would do it again. It was one of the most fun things I did professionally in the last probably 5 years.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've told you this many times already, but it was a great site. But speaking of, I always get self-conscious when I spend time talking to people about kind of old work and not talking about what they're doing now. And
That's all right.
you have a new book out also that I imagine is probably equally as gratifying. And I want to talk about that a little bit because we talked earlier about a lot of your writing focusing on food and design, and this book seems like a one of the clearest ways where those things came together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, I would love for you to kind of describe what the book is and how it even came into being, because it's such an interesting. I looked at it in I will admit I did not buy it yet, but I looked at it in a bookstore, and it's such a very interesting artifact.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah. So almost to tell you what the book is, I should start with telling you how it came to be, because it's kind of a story that led to an object. Okay. But in it was 4 years from where this all began. In 2013, I went to the Antiquarian Book Fair in San Francisco, just kind of on a whim. I think my dad had told me it was happening, and I decided to go. And I invited my friend Wendy MacNaughton, who's an illustrator, to go with me. And she beat me there. And when she was walking around and I was headed over from the East Bay, she called and was like, "Oh my God, I found this incredible thing! Hurry! You have to get here and look at this." And this bookseller was selling a sketchbook from the 40s that had been in somebody's estate for all this time, and he'd taken it out of the estate, brought it to San Francisco, and was selling it. And it contained all these paintings of food and hand-lettered recipes. The paintings depicted the ingredients for the recipe. And there were like several dozen of them, all contained in this book. And we were struck first by just the art, because it was incredibly vibrant. It was painted in gouache. The technique was amazing. The lettering in her lettering was just so precise that it could only have been done by someone who really knew about lettering and typefaces. And so kind of all of that was the first thing. But then we asked, who was this woman who did it? Her name was Cipe Pineles. And the guy was like, "Oh yeah, she was an art director in New York in the mid-century." So we looked her up, and lo and behold, she was the first ever female art director hired at Condé Nast at the end of the 30s, and did the original art direction for a whole bunch of major Condé Nast publications, and was just tremendously influential. And both of us were kind of, a little stunned that we'd never heard her name. Yeah. Me from being in the publishing world, and Wendy from the art world, and her name hadn't come up in all of our time. So we determined that we really, and the work that we had found at the fair had never been published. So we were like, we have got to take this home with us and get it published. It's amazing.
So you were first just amazed by the artwork, and you didn't know anything about her at this time until you did this research. Okay, that's amazing.
Yeah. So we called our friends, because it was being sold like a piece of art. It was very, very expensive. Okay. So we felt like we can't buy it ourselves. So let's call some friends and see if we can all pool our resources. So we did. And we called Maria Popova and Debbie Millman, and we told them what we had found. And Maria also hadn't heard Cipe's name. Debbie was familiar with her from the New York design world. And so they agreed. So the four of us pooled our resources and bought this thing. Wendy took it home, and her wife is a firefighter, ex-firefighter, retired. Oh, wow. So she was like, "You guys, first thing you do is buy a fireproof safe for this thing." So she bought us a fireproof safe, and we put the thing in there. And then we were like, "Okay, now what?" And the really cool thing is, Wendy has been working with a literary agent for years named Charlotte Sheedy. And so she called Charlotte and said, "Oh my God, we found this incredible thing. We want to get it published." This woman, her name was Cipe Pineles, and Charlotte, being a longtime New York literary agent, said, "Cipe Pineles, we just have dinner parties together." Like, she knew Cipe personally, socially, and professionally. And so she was then able to connect us with a guy who sort of was Cipe's son, not biologically, but he was the son of someone Cipe was with at the end of her life. And through him, we were then able to contact her daughter, who lives in Toronto, and get in touch with this family and basically be like, we don't know exactly what we want to do, but we want to publish this work that we found. We want to tell her story, and they gave their blessing for that to happen. We visited her daughter, Carol, up in Toronto, and anyway, turned it into a book proposal that was kind of 1/3 biography of Cipe and design history, and then 1/3 the original artwork, which we reproduced, really, really high quality reproductions.
Right.
And then the final third was to be and is all of those recipes that she had painted updated in more of a cookbook format, because the recipes as she had put them down were not necessarily totally accurate or didn't hold up as written.
Yeah.
And so with my kind of like somewhat amateur recipe development skills and pretty well developed cooking skills and the help of a recipe developer who's way more experienced, I redeveloped all the recipes and did like a second version of each one.
Oh, wow. So you did that. You actually went through and kind of did that all yourself with this other person. Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yep. Yeah.
So I'm kind of, the thing that I like about this is two things. Is I think you could kind of look at the book almost as a kind of unconventional monograph for Cipe also, which is what I really like. And I feel like monographs as a form there's only kind of so much variety within that, and I feel like you kind of took it into a different direction. And then also, the fact that all of you only really Debbie and the literary agent knew who Cipe was, that a big part of this project is introducing her to a whole group of people that have no idea who she is, even though she was this influential. And so I'm kind of curious how you thought about, not only are we just republishing these beautiful illustrations, but this is kind of an educational tool and is kind of shining a light on someone who probably always should have been in the design canon but wasn't, and is forgotten somehow. How you thought about kind of structuring that and bringing her back into the canon or into this generation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I most wanted to do was to try to find people who had actually known her personally, because she was born in 1908 and she died in 91. And so, most of her contemporaries have passed, and she did teach at Parsons for a long time, so she had students. I found it a little hard to track down students of hers, in part because the female students, most of them would have changed their last names when they got married after going to Parsons, so it was hard to find them. And, I did a little tracking in that realm and didn't have too much success. So what I ended up, the people who contributed, we decided we want to have some different voices approaching her story from different angles, because there's Cipe as the art director, there's Cipe from the food angle, because obviously she cared about food a lot and she made this, personal work that had so much to do with food.
Right.
And she did a lot of, in her magazine work, she also did a lot of food stories. And then she did a bunch of, she was an educator, and she also did a bunch of branding work. She branded Lincoln Center in the early days, among many other clients. And so there's all these different kind of approaches and angles. And in order to tell a comprehensive story about her, we wanted to have all those different pieces. And so we were thinking, okay, who can write about her as an educator? Who can write about her as an art director? On and on. And who knew her? And we ended up with like a little handful of people. Not everybody who contributed had known her, but Mimi Sheraton, who was, who's this legendary food writer, long time New York Times writer, had known her, had been an entry-level editor at 17 magazine when Cipe was the art director there. And so she had just like incredible anecdotes about life in the editorial and design departments in 1947 in New York. And then Paula Scher had known her. Paula was a young designer in New York when Cipe was there, and they had just a few interactions, but she had a great story about that related a lot to being a woman in design. in that era. And so she shared that story. And then Steve Heller had known her, and she had been like a guest critic at one of his early classes. Or no, he had been a critic at one of her classes at Parsons.
Oh, yeah.
So he wrote about that. And then Myra Coleman, we
Right.
just feel like Myra's work is so so akin to CP's work. Like it practically, when we first saw it, we were like, is that Myra Coleman? It wasn't.
Yeah.
But interestingly, Myra actually wasn't aware of CP. So that was
wow.
And Wendy's work really resembled CP's too. So it was, we had felt like we had several examples of artists working today whose work clearly has taken on that influence, even though CP herself as a name and an identity hasn't been known to these people. So we asked Myra basically to do like an illustrated ode to CP, which she did. And those were the people whose voices came into the storytelling. I just wanted to kind of recognize the many facets of this woman and try to tell those different stories.
Yeah, I love that. This is a little bit off topic, and I know we're getting short on time, but I have two more quick questions. But I also just got the Muriel Cooper monograph. She was the first tenured female professor at the MIT Media Lab, and I was, and is kind of one of the first designers to really start thinking about screens and designing for screens back in the late 80s. And to me, she's very similar. I see a lot of parallels between her and Cipe in that they were kind of pioneers, very influential, but largely forgotten in the scope of history. And so I just love that there's this, I don't even know the word, that there's this kind of growing interest or more conscious interest in these women designers who have had this incredible influence and then no one knows them today. And so I think your book, I think the Muriel Cooper book does a great job of bringing her to a new generation. I think your book does a good job of that, but then also outside of design also with the food angle. And so my girlfriend loves food and cooking, and she saw it on a food blog that she ran. She's like, do you know who this person is? I was like, oh yeah, I'm actually interviewing Sarah in a couple days. So I just love that this is kind of now finally feels like something that people think is important. You know what I mean? I have kind of two quick questions that I ask everybody kind of at the end of the conversation. And the first one is, I'm curious, what's missing from kind of contemporary design discourse right now, or what are the topics or issues or subjects that you think designers, design writers, critics should be talking about, writing about, working through right now?
Oh, I feel like I would want time to think about this.
Yeah, I should have prepared you.
Gosh.
I always save this for last, and it always becomes the hardest question.
Well, I mean, I probably, if I thought about it for a long time, I'd have a lot of different answers, but I'll give you the one that comes to my mind.
Okay, that's great.
Straight away, which is just something I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, which is the way the world is designed towards gender for young people. Yeah. I think that this is, coming from personal experience. I have two little kids, and my older one, who's 4, I'm watching him be shaped in all ways, psychologically, emotionally, socially, intellectually, etc. Increasingly by things that aren't me. And he's kind of like a unique little kid, and I'm really noticing the way he and his friends are like taking cues from the world, and that's setting new guardrails around who they identify as. And I guess it's a long-winded way of saying, I'm watching identity and formation right now and thinking about the ways that we don't consider how much of that is designed in some ways by our material culture, by colors and forms and things that we decide belong to one or another identity. And I'm really like, I think it is easy to understate, and yet it shouldn't be. It should be hard to overstate how much that matters, like in the world. Like, it's how we have ended up with the type of men in power we have.
Yep.
I believe. Yep. And and that starts really young. And so I've been thinking about ways we could redesign some aspects of our material culture to create fewer limits for kids.
Yeah, that's. I mean, so first of all, I love that you kind of answered with what you're thinking about now. That's the way that a lot of people end up answering that question. So I love that. And secondly, a theme that comes up in a lot of the conversation I have is how design is kind of designed objects are ideologies made manifest, made concrete. And so that's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, but I've never thought about it in regards to children, especially in how it's shaping, the youngest people in the world. And so I think that's such a kind of fascinating angle on all of this. My last question is kind of who are the writers who have really influenced you or have shaped the way you think about kind of all of these things that we've been talking about, or even who are the writers that you would, if you were assigning a reading list or something, who are those people that you kind of always are pointing to?
Let's see. Well, I mean, there are, John Thakura, who I already mentioned once, was a person who I feel like was an early, he kind of opened my eyes to some of that stuff around design and culture. I mean, in the present moment, like Rob Walker, who I also mentioned, I think does an incredible job of writing about design. I'm trying to think, Jeff's wife, Nicola Twilley, writes about design really in a lot of ways, in food and history and science all together, and does just a brilliant job, I think, of looking at culture in a new way and from a new angle.
Sarah, thank you so much for talking with me.
Fun to talk.
This, like I said, I'm a big fan of all of your work and have been looking forward to this for a while. So thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
This episode was recorded on November 1st, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.